There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from living in two places at once. You're sitting in a room full of people, nodding at the right moments and laughing when you're supposed to. But somewhere beneath the surface of your attention, another world is unfolding with its own light, its own logic, its own emotional weather. The strange thing is, that world feels more real than the one pressing against your skin. You've probably wondered if something is wrong with you, if other people experience reality the way you do, or if they're somehow more tethered to the present moment and more satisfied by what simply is. What is has always felt like a rough draft to you, a sketch waiting to be filled in by something richer that lives just beyond the edge of what you can touch. This isn't about escapism, not really, because it goes deeper than that. It's about where you feel most yourself, where your thoughts have texture and weight, where emotions don't just pass through you, but build cathedrals and entire landscapes of meaning that you can walk through again and again, while perfecting the details that no one else will ever see. You might be someone who replays conversations that never happened, who builds entire relationships in your mind with people you've barely spoken to, who spends hours constructing scenes and dialogues, and alternate versions of your life where you said the right thing, and where you were braver, and where the world bent toward you instead of away. In those moments you're not daydreaming but living, more vividly than you do when you're standing in line at the grocery store, or sitting through another meeting that could have been an email. The outer world often feels like waiting for something to begin, and for life to match the intensity of what you carry inside. And that's when you retreat inward, not because you're weak, but because that's where the colour is, and that's where things matter in the way you need them to matter. But there's a cost to this, a strange grief that comes from knowing your most meaningful experiences are ones you can never fully share. You can try to explain the world you've built and the characters you've lived alongside, and the emotional arcs that have shaped you more than any real event. But the words always fall short, and so you learn to keep it to yourself. You learn to live with the knowledge that the most alive parts of you exist in a place other people can't visit. Sometimes the guilt creeps in, like you're wasting your life or avoiding it. Like you should be more present and more engaged with what's in front of you. You see other people who seem content with the surface of things and who don't need to descend into imagined depths to feel fulfilled. And you wonder if they have something figured out that you're missing, or maybe they're missing something you've found. The truth is, you've always been this way. Even as a child, you disappeared into stories more completely than other kids. You didn't just read books, but lived inside them. You didn't just play pretend, but built entire mythologies. And when you were forced back into the regular world, it felt like waking from a dream that was more meaningful than anything happening in your waking life. You're not broken and you're not avoiding reality. You're someone whose inner world has gravity, whose imagination isn't just a tool for creativity or problem solving, but a place of residence where you've furnished rooms and planted gardens and built sanctuaries that hold the versions of yourself you can't quite be out here. And the question that haunts you isn't whether this is healthy or unhealthy, adaptive or maladaptive. Because the question is simpler and more painful than that. Why does the world inside feel more like home than the world outside? This is what we're here to understand, not to fix and not to cure, but to explore. To look closely at the psychology of people like you. People who feel more alive in their imagination than they ever do in their living rooms. People who have built inner worlds so rich and detailed that reality itself feels like an interruption. Because maybe the answer isn't about learning to be more present. Maybe it's about understanding why presence has always meant something different for you. Why being here has never been enough. When there, that invisible and impossible place inside you has always felt like where you were meant to be. Your brain doesn't work the way you think it does. When you slip into your inner world, you're not just thinking or imagining in the way most people understand those words, because you're activating entire networks of neural architecture that light up as if you're actually experiencing what you're envisioning. Your visual cortex flickers to life, and your emotional centers respond with real feeling, and the boundary between imagined and real becomes, neurologically speaking, surprisingly thin. There's something called the default mode network, a constellation of brain regions that activate when you're not focused on the external world, when you're daydreaming and remembering and imagining futures and constructing narratives. For most people, this network is a background hum, a place the mind wanders during idle moments, but for you, it might be more like a second home, where you don't just wander, but where you've built foundations. Research into fantasy proneness reveals something fascinating, that about 4% of people score exceptionally high on measures of vivid and immersive fantasy life. These aren't people with psychosis or dissociative disorders, but people whose imaginations have unusual depth and persistence, people who can spend hours in imagined scenarios that feel as emotionally real as lived experience, people who perhaps are a lot like you. This capacity isn't random and it has roots. Often it begins in childhood. Maybe you grew up in an environment that was emotionally barren or unpredictable, and your imagination became a place of safety, a place where you had control and where things made sense and where you could be understood in ways you weren't out here. Or maybe you grew up around stories, books and films and myths that taught you meaning lives in narrative and not in the mundane succession of days. Or maybe your brain was simply born with a higher capacity for absorption, which is the term psychologists use for the ability to become fully immersed in mental imagery, to lose track of time and space, to let your consciousness dissolve into something you're imagining so completely that the outside world fades. It's a trait that correlates with openness and with creativity, and with a personality that seeks depth over surface and complexity over simplicity. But here's what matters, that this isn't a disorder, not inherently at least. The line between healthy imagination and what gets called maladaptive daydreaming isn't about the vividness of your inner world, but about whether that world has become a prison instead of a sanctuary, whether you're choosing to go there or whether you're hiding there because the alternative feels unbearable. And that distinction matters because your inner world is a gift. It's where you process complexity that the outer world can't hold, where you rehearse versions of yourself you're still becoming, where you experience emotions at their full intensity, undiluted by the compromises and performances that social reality demands. Your imagination isn't a bug in your psychological software, but a feature, an adaptation, a way your mind has learned to create the richness that external reality doesn't always provide. Think about what happens when you're in one of those immersive states. Time collapses and hours pass like minutes. You're not aware of your body, or your surroundings, or your obligations. You're there in the imagined space, and everything about it feels necessary, where the details matter and the emotional stakes are real. You're not observing a fantasy, but living one. This is your brain doing what it was designed to do, which is simulate and predict and create models of possible worlds, except your brain does it with unusual intensity and persistence. Where others might imagine something briefly and move on, you construct and inhabit and refine. You return to the same scenarios and the same characters and the same emotional territories while deepening them each time until they have the weight of memory. And because you can do this, because your inner world has this gravitational pull, the outer world often feels flat by comparison. Ordinary conversations lack the depth of the dialogues you've imagined. Real relationships can't compete with the idealized connections you've built in your mind. Your actual life feels like a pale shadow of the life you're living internally. This isn't because you're delusional or ungrateful, but because your brain has a higher threshold for emotional and imaginative engagement. You need more, not more stuff, but more meaning, more resonance, more of that feeling of being fully and completely and undeniably alive. And your imagination gives you that because it always has. The question isn't whether you should stop, but what to do with this capacity, how to honor it without being consumed by it, how to let it enrich your life instead of replace it. Because the architecture of your fantasy life isn't something to dismantle, but something to understand, to work with, to recognize as the particular way your consciousness reaches toward beauty and toward meaning and toward the life you sense is possible, but haven't quite figured out how to live. There are gifts that cost something to carry. Your imagination is one of them. Because yes, it gives you access to depths other people never touch. It makes you sensitive to nuance and to subtext and to the emotional currents beneath what's being said. You can read a story and live inside it for days. You can hear a piece of music and construct entire narratives around it. You can meet someone once and build a whole mythology about who they might be and what you might mean to each other, and how your lives might weave together in some imagined future. This is a form of richness, a kind of emotional and creative abundance, but it's also lonely, because the connections you build in your mind are always more perfect than the ones you build in reality, where the conversations flow better and the understanding is complete, and there's no awkwardness or misunderstanding or moment where you reach for someone and find they're not reaching back. In your inner world, you're always met and always seen and always enough. And then you step back into your actual life, and the contrast is almost unbearable. Real people disappoint, not because they're bad or wrong, but because they're real. They're distracted and inconsistent and limited by their own inner worlds. They can't meet you at the depth you've imagined, and they can't be the characters you've cast them as. And that's when you feel this strange grief, this mourning for relationships that never existed, and for a connection that was always one-sided because it only ever lived inside you. You start to realize that your imagination isn't just an escape, but a measuring stick, and reality almost always comes up short. This is where the danger lives. Not in the imagination itself, but in the way it teaches you to prefer absence over presence, to choose the perfect imagined version over the flawed real thing. You start to withdraw, not dramatically but gradually, where you're physically present but emotionally elsewhere, nodding and smiling and participating while the part of you that matters is somewhere else. Living a scene you'll never get to show anyone. And the loneliness of this is profound because you can't explain it. If you try to tell someone that you feel more connected to people you've imagined than to people you actually know, they'd worry. They'd think you were losing touch with reality. They wouldn't understand that it's not about delusion, but about intensity, about the level of emotional engagement you need to feel alive. And that's when you keep it to yourself. You become someone with a secret life, not a scandalous one, and not a dangerous one, but a life that's rich and meaningful, and completely invisible. And you learn to live with the fact that the most meaningful parts of your experience are ones you can never fully share. There's also the guilt, the creeping sense that you're wasting your life. While other people are out there doing things, building careers and forming relationships and making memories, you're sitting alone spinning stories in your head that will never matter to anyone but you. You feel like you're choosing fantasy over reality, and maybe that makes you weak or afraid or somehow less capable of handling life as it is. But here's what that guilt doesn't account for: that your inner world isn't empty entertainment, but where you process things, where you make sense of experiences you haven't had words for, where you're working through questions that don't have easy answers. Your imagination is your laboratory, and your studio and your sanctuary. It's where you go to figure out who you are and who you want to become. Still, the guilt persists because you can feel the gap between where you are and where you think you should be. You watch people around you seem satisfied with simpler pleasures and with surface-level interactions and with lives that don't require constant internal narration, and you wonder if there's something they've accepted that you're still resisting, if maybe the key to happiness is learning to want less depth and less meaning and less aliveness than what you've always demanded. But you can't make yourself want less. You've tried, and you've tried to be more present and more engaged and more satisfied with what's in front of you. And it works for a while, maybe a few hours or maybe a few days, but then you feel that pull inward, and that need to return to the place where things make sense and where you feel most yourself. And you go back because you have to, and because that's where you breathe. The other edge of this sword is the way imagination can become armor, a way to avoid being hurt by real connection. If you never let anyone all the way in, and if you keep the most meaningful parts of yourself in that inner sanctuary where no one can reach, then you never have to risk being truly seen and found lacking. You can maintain control, and you can ensure that the version of yourself you're living with, the imagined one and the ideal one, never has to face the disappointment of someone else's reality. This is the protection and the prison of it. Your inner world keeps you safe, but it also keeps you isolated. It gives you everything you need emotionally, but it can't give you the one thing that only reality offers, which is the surprise of actual connection, the shock of being understood by someone outside your own mind, the strange and terrifying gift of being loved not for who you imagine yourself to be, but for who you actually are. And maybe this is the real question at the heart of it all. How do you honor the richness of your inner world without using it to hide from the messiness of outer life? How do you stay true to your need for depth while remaining open to the imperfect and incomplete but real connections that only exist outside your imagination? Because you can't live entirely in one world or the other, not without losing something that matters. The answer isn't to choose. That's the trap you've been living in. The belief that you have to pick one world and abandon the other. That you need to either fully commit to reality and let your inner world atrophy, or accept that you're someone who will always be half present and half elsewhere, and never quite belonging to either place completely. But what if the work isn't about choosing, but about integration, about finding a way to let both worlds feed each other, instead of compete? This starts with a shift in how you see your imagination, not as an escape, and not as a coping mechanism, and not as evidence that you can't handle reality, but as a capacity, a way of engaging with life that's rare and valuable. Your ability to construct inner worlds isn't a sign of weakness, but a sign of a mind that refuses to accept surfaces, a consciousness that demands deeper meaning. And once you stop seeing it as something to fix or overcome, you can start asking a different question, which is, how do I bring this aliveness into the world? Because your imagination isn't meant to stay locked inside, but to be metabolized and channeled and expressed. When you pour it into something tangible, writing or art or music, or building actual worlds that others can enter, the dynamic changes, and your inner life stops being a secret and becomes a gift. The intensity you feel, and the depth you crave, and the emotional landscapes you've mapped so carefully can become bridges to other people who feel the same way. This is why so many people with rich inner worlds are drawn to creative work. Not because they're trying to express themselves in some vague and self-indulgent way, but because creation is the only way to make the inner world visible, to take what's invisible and give it form, to say, this is what it's like inside me, and this is what I see when I close my eyes, and this is the kind of aliveness I've been living with alone. And when you do that, when you translate even a fraction of your inner experience into something others can witness, you realize you are never as alone as you thought. There are others who recognize what you've made, who say, yes, that's it exactly, and I thought I was the only one. But integration isn't just about creative output. It's also about learning to live imaginatively within reality itself, to bring the same attention and the same emotional engagement and the same sense of meaning-making that you apply to your inner world and direct it outward. This is harder than it sounds because reality is messier and it doesn't follow narrative logic. It's full of loose ends and anticlimaxes and moments that don't mean anything. But what if you started treating your actual life the way you treat your imagined ones? What if you brought the same curiosity and the same willingness to go deep and the same refusal to accept superficiality? You might start noticing things you've been missing. The way light falls through a window at a certain hour, the micro expressions on someone's face when they're trying to hide what they're feeling, the strange and unexpected poetry that shows up in ordinary moments if you're paying attention. Because reality has its own depth and it's just harder to access because you can't control it the way you can control your imagination. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the real work is learning to tolerate the lack of control, to be present with what is instead of what could be, not because what is better, but because it's the only place where you can actually be surprised, where you can encounter something you didn't put there yourself. This doesn't mean abandoning your inner world, but recognizing that your imagination is a lens and not a destination. It's how you process life and how you understand it and how you find meaning in it. But it works best when it's in conversation with reality and not in competition with it. You might start small, allowing yourself to be curious about real people the way you're curious about imagined ones, asking questions that go beneath the surface and creating space for actual conversations to unfold without already knowing how they'll go. Letting someone surprise you and letting them be complicated and inconsistent and real. And you might find that real connection when it happens has something your imagination can't replicate, which is reciprocity, the experience of being affected by someone who is also being affected by you, of building something together that neither of you could have built alone, because your imagination can give you depth, but it can't give you that. There's also the matter of finding your people, because you're not the only one living this way. There are communities of people who understand what it means to have a rich inner world, who write elaborate stories no one will read and who construct entire languages for imaginary cultures and who live half their emotional lives in places that don't exist on any map. These people exist, and when you find them, when you realize you're not alone in this particular way of being, the isolation starts to dissolve. You don't have to explain yourself as much, and you can speak in the shorthand of people who share the same strange inheritance, this gift and burden of feeling most alive inside your own head. But even as you find integration, and even as you learn to bridge the gap between inner and outer, there will still be moments when the contrast hurts, when you slip back into an imagined scene and feel that familiar pang of recognizing that this depth and this intensity and this perfect understanding isn't something you have in your actual life. And that's okay, because that's not failure, but just the cost of being someone whose consciousness reaches towards something beyond what's immediately available. Your imagination will always be a step ahead of your reality, because that's its nature. But over time, the gap can narrow, not because you've dimmed your imagination, but because you've learned to infuse your reality with more of what your imagination has always been seeking: meaning and beauty and connection and aliveness. These things don't only exist in the worlds you've built inside yourself, but exist out here too, scattered and hidden and waiting to be found. And your imagination, that very thing that's made you feel so isolated, is actually your greatest tool for finding them, because you've spent your whole life practicing the art of seeing beneath surfaces, of finding depth where others see nothing, of constructing meaning from raw experience. You're not broken for living this way, and you're not avoiding life. You're someone whose relationship with consciousness is deeper and stranger than most people's. Someone who's been building cathedrals in your mind because you needed a place beautiful enough to house the intensity of what you feel. And maybe the real integration happens when you stop seeing those cathedrals as separate from the world, when you realize that the beauty you've been building inside is also a map, a blueprint for the kind of life you're meant to live. Not in fantasy, but right here, in the messy and imperfect and surprising world that's been waiting for you to bring your full self to it. You've always been more alive in your imagination, but what if that's been teaching you all along what true aliveness feels like, so that when you finally find it out here, in a conversation that goes deep, and in work that matters, and in a moment of real connection, you'll recognize it, because you've already lived it inside yourself all this time.